Welcome to the video series on the nervous system. We're going to first look at nervous tissue and the function of nervous tissue and how neural impulses are transmitted, and then we'll get into the central nervous system. And then we're going to focus on neural transmission and look at the way that if you interfere with that neural transmission, either by pharmaceutical drugs such as caffeine, cocaine, tetrodotoxin, Botox, curare, how this exactly happens. And then, for example, when you deal with clinical aspects of depression, what type of drugs are used and how do they affect neural transmission to get you the intended effect? We'll look at myasthenia gravis and nerve gas and how they affect the neuromuscular junction. Shown here is a neuron and the muscle it's innervating. And we'll look at how that interferes with neural transmission. And once you understand these things, then you can pretty much understand a number of different drugs and their effects on the nervous system. So when you look at the nervous system functions, it's the nervous system and the endocrine system are the two primary control systems of the body. The endocrine system is going to use hormones as its messenger, and it'll go through the blood from the gland, go through the blood into its effector organ. The nervous system, however, uses neural transmission, and that's going to be a electrical chemical response, where we see the movement of two basic ions that move along this neuron in order to conduct a neural impulse, and those two ions are sodium and potassium. Organization of the nervous system. The basic organization, it consists of a brain and spinal cord that we call the central nervous system, and then you also have the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is everything that comes off the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system can be divided up into two other systems. These consist of the somatic nervous system, which is what you have voluntary control over. It's going to all the skeletal muscles. So the nerves that innervate the skeletal muscles that you have voluntary control over are part of the somatic nervous system. And then you also have nerves that come out that they don't innervate skeletal muscle, they innervate the other organs, such as the eyes and salivary glands and heart and lungs and stomach. This is divided into the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system you don't have voluntary control over. Autonomic nervous system consists of two branches. It consists of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. We'll see that the sympathetic nervous system is that for fight or flight. It's going to activate a number of body processes to get you ready for the fight or flight. The parasympathetic is typically known as a rest and digest. It activates processes that reverse generally the sympathetic nervous system. So instead of having an increased heart rate with the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow your heart rate. However, the parasympathetic isn't just for slowing down things such as the heart rate and breathing rate in the lungs and bronchoconstriction, whereas sympathetic is going to cause bronchodilation. Parasympathetic also is involved with activating the digestive processes, so the movement of the food through the GI tract, secretion of glands for digestive juices, salivary glands, are going to be run by the parasympathetic nervous system. So, as we talked about, the nervous system is organized into two major divisions, either the central and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system has a brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system consists of nerves, cranial and spinal, that lie outside the brain and spinal cord. So shown down here is a sensory neuron. We're going to see that transmission goes from receptors in the periphery to the central nervous system. Motor or efferent neurons transmit impulses from the central nervous system, shown here in the spinal cord, to muscles and glands. So we have somatic motor neurons. They go to skeletal muscles, which you have voluntary control over. And you have autonomic motor neurons that go to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, which you don't have voluntary control over, and hence they are the autonomic nervous system, or part of the autonomic nervous system that they have control over. And hence these structures are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which you do not have voluntary control over. Sensory stimuli. When those sensory stimuli are coming in through the sensory neurons, they come into the spinal cord or the brain. Shown here, these are sensory neurons that are coming in. These are the cell bodies of those sensory neurons. They're typically right by the spinal cord. So I'm going to come back to the next slide here, and you can see here's a sensory neuron. There's the cell body of that sensory neuron that's going into the spinal cord here. Motor neurons have their cell body in the spinal cord and an extension coming out, such as a somatic motor neuron. Autonomic motor neurons have their cell body here, at least the preganglionic neuron, and they'll synapse with a second neuron called a postganglionic neuron, which will carry that impulse out. Well, the sensory impulses that come in are going to come into the spinal cord, and then this neuron is going to make contact with the next neuron. That circle right there is the cell body of that next neuron. And it'll send an action potential on up through the spinal cord up into the brain where it gets processed in the cortex. So all sensory inputs come in through the spinal cord and then up to the brain, unless of course you have nerves going directly into the brain. So to give you an example on these sensory stimuli, I'm going to show you a short video of human biologists that are experimenting with sensory input.
They're trying to decide right now where to let the crawfish bite them. So they're trying to decide who's going to be first. We'll be back as soon as that decision is made. Well, it looks like that Nick's going to be first.
What is it?
All right. Do the nipple.
Good.
Let's see if he can do it.
Get him off of me! Get him off of me! He's getting harder! He's getting harder! Calm down. Calm down. That was the worst idea ever!
All right, so that was an example of sensory input coming into the brain and his brain processing that. Now you also have motor stimuli. So here up in the brain we have these cell bodies shown here within the gray matter of the brain, cortex of the brain, and they're going to send action potentials down these axons that come all the way down the spinal cord, and they're going to go and they're going to synapse with a cell body of another motor neuron. We call these upper motor neurons, and then it comes down and synapses with a lower motor neuron. And this is the portion that's going out to, well, whatever muscle you're going to, skeletal muscle. So for example, if you look here on the spinal cord, the motor neuron that would have its cell body up in the cortex would run down along the spinal cord and synapse with a second neuron right here in this area of the spinal cord, and then send out that second neuron on out to the muscle to be innervated, that lower motor neuron. And then that would control the skeletal muscle. So it's going to go out to the skeletal muscle and cause it to contract. So to give you an idea on how skeletal muscle contracts, here's somebody, he's using his skeletal muscles. See how he's contracting it? Monkeys have skeletal muscles too.
The trunk monkey theft retrieval system. Because sometimes getting your car back is simply not enough. Another revolutionary idea. You'll only find at Suburban Auto Group.
And there you go. There's skeletal muscle contraction. So the peripheral nervous system can be divided up into two subdivisions. You have the somatic nervous system, which consists of sensory or afferent neurons. They transmit impulses into the somatic receptors from the skin and special senses of vision, hearing, taste, smell, to the central nervous system. These are the ones that you perceive consciously. They also have an efferent division, or the motor neurons, and they transmit impulses from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. They're responsible for your voluntary control of skeletal muscles as well as reflexes. When you look at the autonomic nervous system, it has both sensory and motor neurons. The sensory neurons transmit impulses from the visceral receptors to the central nervous system. So for example, you remember when we were talking about the baroreceptors that were located in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. They sense differences in blood pressure. When your blood pressure drops, those baroreceptors sense the decrease in pressure and then send via sensory neurons or afferent neurons input into the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata, which is a control center you have there in the brain that controls blood pressure, will then send motor or efferent neurons to cardiac muscle in that case and cause heart muscle to contract more strongly, increase heart rate. It also sends signals to smooth muscle in the blood vessels, particularly the arterioles, to vasoconstrict, which also increases blood pressure. Now, the autonomic nervous system can be divided into two subdivisions. You have parasympathetic and sympathetic, and oftentimes these two subdivisions innervate the same organ. So we have sympathetic going to the heart. We have parasympathetic also going to the heart. Sympathetic is going to accelerate heartbeat. It's your fight or flight portion of your autonomic nervous system. Whereas parasympathetic is going to slow heart rate. When you look at the bronchi within the lungs, parasympathetic constricts bronchi, sympathetic dilates bronchi, which makes sense. When you're in the fight or flight, you need to increase the dilation of those bronchi to get more air into the lungs. So when you look at the motor portion of the autonomic nervous system, you have two divisions. You have sympathetic, parasympathetic. In the sympathetic, we call it the fight or flight response, the E division, E meaning exercise, excitement, emergency, or embarrassment. These are all going to be mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic, visceral processes that restore and conserve energy, to rest and digest. Defecation, digestion, diuresis. These are all things that the parasympathetic is involved in. But you don't want to get the impression that the parasympathetic always slows things down, because during digestion, it actually speeds up a number of the activities, such as when we look at the salivary glands, and stimulates peristalsis and secretion in the intestines. So those things are activated by the parasympathetic. So next up, we're going to be talking about the cells of the nervous system.